Today, we're delving into a fascinating and complex topic: the comparison of British and French colonialism in Africa. Of the 54 modern countries in Africa, 22 are former British colonies, and 20 are former French colonies. Combined, these two powers colonized 42 countries, which is more than 3/4 of the continent. While other colonizers such as Belgium, Italy, and Germany were present, their impact was less significant compared to the British and French. In this video, we will examine and compare British and French colonial motivations, methods, impacts, and legacies. To grasp the context, we need to travel back in time. Before European colonization, Africa comprised various societies, kingdoms, and empires, each with its own cultures and structures. Europeans first arrived in Africa during the Age of Discovery as explorers and traders, later followed by missionaries, and finally as conquerors. The Industrial Revolution in Europe spurred their interest in conquering overseas colonies in America, Asia, and Africa, driven by economic benefits such as the demand for raw materials, control of important trade routes, and market expansion for industrial goods. National prestige and the spread of European culture and Christianity were also significant motivations. This resulted in the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, which saw European powers competing to acquire African territories, often without regard for indigenous cultures or existing political structures. By the end of the scramble for Africa, which climaxed at the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference, Britain and France had acquired the largest portions of African land. Britain's territories were mostly in East Africa, such as Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, Southern Africa, such as Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa, with a few colonies in West Africa, such as Nigeria and Egypt in North Africa. In contrast, French colonies were concentrated in West Africa, such as Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Mali, Central Africa, such as the Republic of Congo and Cameroon, and North Africa, such as Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. The British employed a system of indirect rule, particularly in West and parts of East Africa. This method, pioneered by the first British governor of Nigeria, Sir Frederick Lugard, involved governing through local leaders and traditional structures. The traditional leaders found themselves forced to work as British puppets in fear of being totally replaced. In areas without strong local leaders and institutions, the British appointed headmen who were often collaborators acting on the British behalf. This approach minimized resistance by integrating colonial administration with existing power structures. In contrast, the French applied a policy of direct rule, seeking to assimilate African colonies into the French cultural and administrative system. This involved centralizing authority and replacing local leaders and customs with French administrators and French laws. In Senegal, French administrators governed directly, and the local population was expected to adopt French culture and language. Back in 1914, the four communes of Senegal, St. Louis, Dakar, Gorée, and Rufisque, were even given the right to elect a deputy to the French National Assembly, the equivalent of the British House of Commons. Blaise Diagne, who became the first person of West African origin to be elected to the French Chamber of Deputies, was a notable example of the integration of the colonies with Metropole France. French assimilation went beyond governance. Consider the example of Léopold Sédar Senghor. Born in Senegal in 1906, Senghor's journey is a testament to the French colonial policy of assimilation. After excelling in his studies, he moved to France, where he pursued higher education. By the 1930s, Senghor had become a senior classics teacher at the Lycée in Tours, France. This remarkable achievement was indicative of the French approach, as no British public school or grammar school at that time would have accepted an African as a teacher, no matter how brilliant. The British focused on developing cash crop economies and resource extraction, building infrastructure such as railways and ports to facilitate the export of raw materials, often to the detriment of local economies. In Kenya, the British established large-scale coffee and tea plantations, primarily benefiting European settlers while displacing local Kikuyu communities and disrupting their traditional agriculture. The French also exploited their colonies economically but emphasized integration into the French economic system. They developed infrastructure to serve the needs of the metropole and promoted French investment. In Côte d'Ivoire, the French invested in the cocoa industry, making the colony one of the world's leading producers. However, this development often overlooked local needs and perpetuated economic dependency on France. British colonial education systems often emphasized practical skills over higher education, aiming to create a class of Africans who could assist in administration. Missionary schools played a significant role in spreading Western education and Christianity. In Uganda, the British supported missionary activities that established schools and hospitals, creating an educated elite that later played a crucial role in the independence movement. The French aimed for cultural assimilation, promoting the French language, culture, and education. They sought to transform Africans into French citizens, albeit often in a limited and unequal manner. In Algeria, the French established schools to teach French culture and language, but full assimilation was rarely achieved, leading to significant cultural resistance and the rise of nationalist movements. Militarily, both the French and British relied on African soldiers during World War II. These soldiers fought in various theaters such as against the Japanese in Burma and against the Germans in North Africa. After the war, African soldiers were allowed to remain in the French army if they desired. This stands in contrast to the British, who immediately demobilized African soldiers after the war. Many of the African soldiers in the French army remained until their return to their countries after independence in the 1960s, where they took up high positions in the new militaries. British decolonization generally involved negotiating with local elites and preparing colonies for self-governance, albeit often reluctantly and under pressure from nationalist movements. In Ghana, the British facilitated a relatively peaceful transition to independence in 1957, with Kwame Nkrumah becoming the first prime minister. This set a precedent for other British colonies in Africa. French decolonization was often more tumultuous, with significant conflicts and a stronger reluctance to relinquish control. The French government was more inclined to maintain its influence through economic and military means. The Algerian War of Independence between 1954 and 1962 was a brutal conflict resulting in significant loss of life. The eventual independence of Algeria in 1962 marked the end of a bitter struggle against French colonial rule. In summary, British and French colonial rule in Africa differed significantly in their administrative strategies, economic policies, cultural impacts, and approaches to decolonization. The British favored indirect rule and economic exploitation, while the French pursued direct control and cultural assimilation. The British believed Africans were essentially different from Europeans and would stay that way, inviting racism and implying that Africans were not just different but also inferior. The French, by comparison, were prepared to treat Africans as equals, but only if they learned to speak French properly and adopted the values of French culture. If they reached a sufficient level of education, Africans might be accepted as French citizens. Falling below the required level invited charges of racial inferiority. These differing approaches have left distinct legacies in the former colonies, influencing their post-independence trajectories. If you found this comparison insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of African history and its lasting impacts.